All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Lorian Varela, and just to share a little bit about me, my parents originally came to this country from Cuba, so I grew up with English as a second language and being a first generation American and then a first generation college student. And for me, uh, I think one of the challenging things about my experience in college was having to figure out everything on my own. And that experience helped touch in me that I wanted to learn as much as possible so I could share it with other folks to make their experience that much better. And so I am excited to talk about taking control of your semester and being able to share with you some of the tips about learning that I hope means that you can be more effective with your learning and actually get better results by studying less. And so every time I say that to students and I say, would you like to study less and learn more? I have always heard yes. So hopefully you find these tips useful. So for our time today, I'm going to talk about 4 different things. I'm going to start with just an overview of the LRC services. That way you know it and you can share it with other students that you work with. Spend a little bit of time helping to break down how we learn, because I feel like if you understand how the brain is function and how memory works, you're able to figure out the learning strategies and study techniques that would best fit you. So just to start off, a little bit about the LRC services. And actually, let me just give you something that you can put in the chat. Would you put in the chat if you've ever used any of the LRC services? And I'll start going through them and then take a look back at the chat to see what you've used. So we have tutoring, and we have a couple different types of tutoring. The tutoring could be one person, 2 people in a group. They could be more, but we've decided to cut back on the numbers while people are remote. So they're very small groups. They're 1 or 2 people in most groups. And then there's also a new opportunity to do a guided study group. And so what that means is students are sending in that they want to form a study group, and we assign a tutor to work with that group and help them together learn and grow. And so a lot of times we're getting students who maybe don't know anyone in class, and we're trying to see if we get another student and we can match them up so that they can form study groups. Or perhaps somebody's friends with someone in class and they want to do a study group together. We will assign one of our tutors to work with them. And then we have supplemental instruction, and a lot of students like our SI. And basically, SI is where we have a staff member who sits through the class and then takes notes and puts together extra activities and review of what was talked about in class that week. And so the students will go through additional problem solving and work together as a group, and they learn that information better because they get a couple more hours of being guided through the instruction. We have our iPrep services, which iPrep stands for Intensive Preparatory Workshops. And these workshops, they occur right before school starts or at the beginning of the semester. And we did one for chemistry, and what chemistry will do is they'll give a pre-assessment out to folks before the class, and if you score a certain level, they advise, hey, why don't you go through the review and refresh that they have at the LRC, where students will spend 4 hours or 8 hours learning some of the major topics that will help them start chemistry strong. And so we added EPI this year, and we're working right now on organic chemistry and 1000 level maths for next fall. Our study skill workshops are super popular. We have a couple different ways you can do workshops, and oftentimes students know we have workshops, but they don't know how many workshops we have. So we have live workshops that any of you can sign up to go to. And these are group oriented, might even have group activities during them. And so those are available on a calendar on our webpage. And this is actually what our webpage looks like. So if you click on that tile, you'll learn more about the workshop schedule. But then, let's say you're like, I can't go to any of those workshops. You know, I really wish I could learn about procrastination, but I have class at that time. So you can also sign up to do an individual session with our workshop facilitator in which she'll go through that topic with you. And so students really enjoy that because if they can't make the group workshops, they sign up for an individual time to review the workshop material. And then the third option we have is something called Student Lingo. And Student Lingo is this workshop library service we have that you can enter it through our website, and you log into the CU Denver workshop library, and there's 50 different workshops on time management, financial planning, online learning, all of that. And you can go through these workshops at your own pace at any time that you want. We've seen even student orgs maybe go through a workshop and do it together and pause it and talk about it. So there's a lot of different ways you could do that. You could watch a workshop and then sign up for a coaching session with one of our staff and talk about the workshop and talk about your own plans. So a lot of different things that you can do with the workshops. And then our academic support programs. We did one called Academic Reboot, and we sent it out to students, letting them know if they wanted to sign up. We had 4 workshops that we took and squished down into half an hour each, and we did this 2-hour workshop review that occurred before school started for students. And we got really good feedback on that, and it's something we hope to expand in the future of, hey, you want to start off your semester strong? Early on, take this workshop bundle and get up to speed when you start your semester. So those are just some of the things that we have, and I'm going to look in the chat right now. And what I see, tutoring for math, tutoring for chem, some people who we have the opportunity for them to visit us, been to tutoring. Oh, and look, Judy's like, I've been to tutoring, SI, and iPrep. Oh, you use the bones. Yes. We have different resources that you can check out to either use with the tutors or to come up to our area and do a study session. And we have a human skeleton, we have a keyboard, we have organic chemistry models, and different hands-on things. And when we get back in person, we plan to expand that even more. So if you're like, ooh, I really wish that we had this that I could check out for a study session or to use with tutoring, or even for you all to be able to use in your center, go check it out and bring it back, you could let me know, because I want to buy those things. So one more thing about the LRC resources, just to let you know, we have a lot of our things on Navigate. The only thing that isn't on Navigate is SI, because the students in that class receive on Canvas the information of how to log in. But everything else, you can go to Navigate and you can pull it up, and you get through that. On your student portal, you'll see the Make an Appointment button, and when you click on that, if you enter tutoring and workshops, it'll take you to the different services we have. So you'll see the group and the individual workshops, you'll see individual coaching, the English language learner resources, and you'll also see tutoring for course. And when you click on that, it matches it up to your classes, and it tells you what we have tutoring available for. If you don't see a time that fits your schedule, let us know so we can contact our tutor and see if there's other times. And if you don't see a class that you want up there, let us know, because maybe we do have someone on staff who can do tutoring for that, and we'll add them to it. Or we can hire for it when we get enough demand. So I'm going to talk a little bit of how we learn. And as we go through, I want you to think about, oh, does that make sense why the LRC offers that resource? So what we're trying to do is get better and better of learning how we learn and then matching up the right services that our students need. But I will start with just a question to the group. Does anyone here have a hobby, a sport, or an instrument that they play? And if you could put that in the chat. Hobby, sport, or instrument? Ooh, it immediately popped up learning languages. Yes, that is a great example. Used to play violin. Sometimes play piano or guitar. Awesome. Any other? Used to play guitar, poetry, reading, listening. I love it. Soccer, volleyball. Like to play soccer and volleyball. These are great. These are great examples, and I want you to think about those things that you were involved in. And when you first started them, you probably weren't excellent at them. It took you a while to build up those skills and to learn and get better. And so when I hear people say, I'm naturally good at math or I'm naturally good at languages, it's actually what they found in the brain, not necessarily true. So no one is naturally good at anything. You may have an interest, and then that get matched with opportunity, but that when they really break it down, and somebody tells me I'm naturally good at math, and I say, tell me about you growing up and your experience with math, they'll say things like, well, I used to like counting out coins, and then I joined a math club and I got the chance to do that, and then I was so good at math they put me in accelerated math. And so you start to hear that they actually had a lot of opportunities to build those skill sets. So the good thing is everybody has the capacity to learn. It's whether you have enough time and energy to build up that muscle in your brain. And so when you think about sports and instruments and hobbies, you're often good at those because you've gotten to spend a lot of time building up that skill set. And what happens is students come to college and they get really frustrated because the math feels like it's moving at a faster pace, that they're comparing themselves against people in class who maybe have more experience. And that can be really frustrating. You start to go, oh, I'm just not good at it. And it's because maybe you all have different experiences with how you've built up those skills. And we also see it in, just type a quick yes or no. How many of you have heard of the equation, you should be studying 3 hours outside of class for every hour in class? That's a popular thing that I hear, that you should study 3 hours outside of class for every hour in class. You can say yay or nay, whether you have heard that before. Yep. I've heard it. Yes. Yes. Well, I'm going to tell you, yes. Oh, this is good. It is good intentions, and it's actually an average, but it's not accurate. If you are really experienced in something, if you're in an upper level class that you've already had several other classes about it, it is not going to take you 3 hours outside of class for every hour in class. It depends on how full the curriculum is and how much experience you have with it. So I have heard 1-credit labs where students have spent 6 hours outside of class and they get frustrated. They're like, I thought it was 3 and I'm actually spending 6. Am I doing something wrong? And I've heard other people say, I know I'm supposed to spend 3 hours for every hour in class, but I actually only spend 1 hour total a week. It depends on how much experience you have. So at the beginning of the semester, it's crucial to do an inventory of how are you feeling about that class and what should you allocate more time to and what should you do less. But don't think that everything has to be equal, because it won't. That's one of those myths I like to break down. Okay, so now comes the visualization part. I need you to close your eyes, but promise me you won't fall asleep. And I just want you to imagine that you are going across a field for the first time, and no one has ever stepped foot in this field before. And as you walk across the grass, you notice that it's bending in your wake, and you're able to walk through, and the grass is bent over, so you're able to follow that path back. The next day you come back out, and the grass has popped up. It's almost like no one was there. And so you step on it again. Maybe you shuffle your feet a little bit more this time. And so the next day when you come back, you can kind of see a little bit some of the bent and broken grass where you walked. And this time when you go through, you take a stick and you're helping to mark the way. And the next day when you go through, you take a rake. And the next day you go through, you take some gravel. And eventually you have exactly what this picture has. You have a well-worn, traveled path in the field. This is exactly how learning is. The first time you hear something, the pathway isn't as strong. And you need to come back to it multiple times to build and strengthen that pathway. Each time you go back and you work with it in a different way using a different tool and repeatedly going through, you make it more formed. And that's what's happening in your head with the synapses. You're creating a strong bridge connection between those cells. And that's where information is stored. Every time you do it, it rises up in your attention and then it sinks back down after you've stopped using it. But every time you do it, each time it rises, it falls a little less. So that it's called resting activation. When you're learning something in class and you touch it multiple times and you use the information verbally, you write it in notes, you do practice problems, you use different techniques, you're raising it in your brain so it's more easier to recall and it's more easier to travel. So just keep that in mind. Learning is like building a pathway in a a field that has never been touched. And then for those who are like, I like the science of it, here's your sciencey type page. When you learn something, that's called sensory input. It goes into what's called sensory information. So you just hear something, maybe a temperature, a new song, a piece of information in psychology class. It goes into essentially that's the working memory. And no matter how advanced we get, scientists have not figured out a way to expand our working memory. So in other words, while we have a lot more potential within our brain, our working memory is fixed. It's just like a computer. It has so many gigabytes of RAM, and it can't go beyond that. And so when your working memory gets full, you start to forget things. It gets at capacity. You can't put new things in it. So when a new student comes to the university, they're learning where to go, the names of streets, where to pick up the groceries, doing their cable for their rental, in addition to learning all the other things. And so their working memory is full. And they find themselves losing their keys, misplacing their coffee cup, forgetting where their wallet is. These are all examples of working memory being at capacity. It's not that you're being forgetful or not paying attention. It's that it's actually full. And so what we need to do is give attention to the facts that we want to keep. And that moves into short-term memory. Now, that's the thing that keeps lowering, because if you don't use it, it kind of starts to fade. So it requires what they call maintenance rehearsal, which is essentially, it requires practice. You got to use it. You got to do things with it. And once you do that, it gets encoded and it goes to long-term memory. And you may lose some memory over time. People discover like they can't remember a phone number that they just got, but they remember their childhood phone number. An example of something that was used enough and went into long-term memory. And so you want to pay attention and you want to use things in order to make them go to long-term memory to give yourself more space in the working memory. And so some of the ways that people can move things from working memory into short-term memory, working memory into short-term memory and then into long-term memory is by chunking it. And so if you've ever seen a little kid learning to brush their teeth, I have a niece and a nephew. And when they were younger, they're 5 now, but when they were a little bit younger, they were learning to brush their teeth. And it was a disaster. I had to remind them to shut off the faucet. And they needed to put the toothpaste on the toothbrush before they put it in their mouth. And it was so neat because I could actually see that they were learning each of these steps. And it was filling their little brains of the act of toothbrushing was broken into a dozen different things they had to do. When you get good enough at it, it starts to crunch down and it doesn't take up as much memory space and it becomes toothbrushing. And then it moves to short term, then to long term, and you've got more space opened up. So when you learn an algebraic equation, it's all those separate pieces. But as you get better and practice with it more, it starts to chunk up and it becomes a thought of this type of equation, and you think about all those steps wrapped up in it. But this is also the reason why tutoring is so important. What happens with our professors is they're so good in their subject matter They studied it in undergraduate. They studied it for their master's, and they studied it for their doctorate. And then if they've been teaching for years, they forgot all the little steps. You know, and really good teachers, they try to break it back down, but they will never remember all those steps as somebody who's been closer to the introduction of the material. So when you hear in class, sometimes the professors skip steps because they just can't remember it because they have it all chunked in their head. But then when you go to tutoring, tutors are able to say, oh yeah, I learned that last year, and these are the specific steps that take you to the next sequence. And so whether it's a tutor or being in a study group where you're explaining things to one another, that's what really helps people learn. Now, just a quick story. I'm checking the time. Just a quick story because I like to tell this story so that people remember. But there's a quote, forgetting is a friend of learning. And these two folks, Dr. Robert Bajork and Dr. Elizabeth Bajork, husband and wife team, they're out at UCLA and they're both professors in psychology. And they have studied remembering and forgetting and memory capacity for years. They are awesome humans. I saw them speak and they each give each other credit for the great works that they do. So they're a super combo. But they formed out at UCLA a lab that's called Bajork Learning and Forgetting Lab. And I often think like, how cool. I'd love to work there and be like, I work at the Learning and Forgetting Lab. But what they've discovered is you have to let things sink down and forget and then struggle to remember, and that helps raise that in your memory. And so these are the folks that advocated spacing apart studying, coming back to studying frequently, and you're going to see in some of the tips I give in the next section, it is built on the work that these two humans have done about the power of forgetting and how that is an essential part of learning. So essentially, if you struggle while you're learning, that is good. That is a good sign. And I just like to remind people in general, like fail can stand for the first attempt in learning. That there isn't the expectation of perfection when you're learning something new. Instead, to remember that sport or that hobby or that instrument, you had to make mistakes to learn how to improve it and get better. The only time failure is a lost opportunity is when if you get a quiz back or a paper back or a test back that you didn't do as well as you wanted, if you don't spend time looking, and we call it doing an autopsy, if you don't spend an autopsy on that assignment and trying to figure out what was it that happened, what did you do well, where could you have learned, how could you have studied differently, if you don't spend the time analyzing it, then that opportunity gets lost. And so failing is part of learning, and it's only a wasted opportunity if you don't analyze. So I will stop just briefly and ask folks if there's any questions that are coming up for you before I move to learning strategies. Let me pull up the poll. Not the poll, the chat. No? All right, so a check. In that section I just did talking about learning, just write really quickly what was something that stuck to you, that you're like, huh, interesting, or I didn't know that, or I totally knew that, it was good to hear it again.
Can you give us the question one more time?
Sure thing. Just share if there was something that stood out to you, something that was new to you, something that was interesting, any of those. We're practicing that you just learned something. Let's recall it.
The chunking was new for me. I never thought about that, but when you've done something repeatedly, you do forget steps and chunk it together. It just flows and you completely forget that they're there's that step. Um, I'm wondering if it's possible for you to create or invent a, a workaround or a shortcut in chunking.
Mm. I think you can. Shortcut is some of these things coming up that when you use them, they help you crunch it down faster. So that's an excellent thing. After we go through this next section, if it still lingers, will you let me know? And I'm glad that you said that because like if I had to sit down and explain to somebody how to write a paragraph, I forget. But when you sit with a writing center consultant and they can break it down so specifically, I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. So someone wrote, I thought it was interesting to hear that you have to forget something and struggle in order to learn, and that it was good to hear these things again. Working memory was interesting, especially the part where all the information you learned isn't necessarily gone. It's just not readily available for immediate use. Awesome. At the beginning of quarantine, I started playing strategy board games and I was the worst. Not after a while, I've been getting so good at it because I analyze my game after every session. It's amazing. That is such a great example. Yeah, and I've been getting into strategy games too, so I'm starting to get better at them. So keep thinking about these, and as we go through, if you have any questions, I want you to pause me or say something in the chat so that I can explain it more. Because this is the quick snapshot. I'm taking tons of learning science information and then just breaking it down into how it's really applied. So tip number one, like when you're learning, like effective ways to learn where you can spend less time and learn more effectively, using notes with diagrams. There is something about the act that when you hear or read something and you write or type notes, but then you create a diagram that explains it, it has magnified the learning. It is stronger, and exactly what Natalia was saying, it helps you do a shortcut to learn it quicker, faster. So keep that in mind as you take notes, if you can do diagrams with them. And let me give you an example of some of the different diagrams that you can use. So it's all types of diagrams. You could have an infographic that you put together. You, especially in anatomy and biology, a lot of students do labeling where they have the blank picture and then they add to it. Some people do like the graphic organizer, trying to figure out what's the same and what's different. I've seen people do timelines, cartoon strips, doodles, arrows, all sorts of things. But when you diagram it, it's a superpower that stands out in your head better. And making connections. Something about when people learn something and they can apply it in real life, it sticks better. And so when I was talking about the Bajork couple, what I have found is if I give you a little bit of the story behind them, if I talk about how cool it would be to work at the lab, and I talk about their great relationship, and they worked in psychology and did all this research, I have taken this up and I've added more detail to it, but I've made it connected to real life examples that I find that if I ask you next week, you'll remember about that specific slide a little more deeply. And so when you take a concept and you try to see how things are similar, how things are different, and how they connect to real life, then it stands out in your head. So as you're learning things in your class, think to yourself, how do I see that occur in everyday life? How could that be useful to somebody who's an engineer? How could that be useful to someone who's a social worker? So just give it context. And explaining it. This is why tutoring and small groups, study groups, are so effective. When you ask yourself questions and you're like, I learned that concept. Why? How does it work? How would I explain it to someone else? What are all the things I can remember about it? When you do things like that, it's causing you to imagine going down that field of grass. You're bringing sticks, and you're bringing a rake, and you're bringing a shovel, and you're bringing, different bags of gravel. You're using it and explaining it in different ways, and it's going to stick out in your head more. Now, practice recall. This is another thing. This is a definite shortcut effectiveness. When you learn something, you could spend all this time highlighting in your book as you're reading, or you could write down all these notes and spend a lot of time doing that. But if instead you write a summary thing and you go back to it and you say, I'm going to quiz myself and I'm going to see how much I remember. When you do things like that, you're forcing yourself to pull it back up in your memory, and you're forcing yourself to write down as much as you remember and know. You can go back and fill in the gaps, and that helps you see the points that need more strengthening and helps re-emphasize the points you remember. So practice recall is really good. And I tell folks, even if you don't have a study group partner, or you don't have a family member or a roommate in your house or a significant other to talk to, get, if you have a fish, if you have a cat, if you have a dog, you can explain it to them. They don't know what you're saying, so they're going to think it's great, especially if you give them a treat. But, just talking it out loud, so actually not just thinking in your head, but saying it out loud, it's stronger. Think of it as like a stronger glue. And every time you do that, it gets better. So if you don't have any of those, talk to a picture, but explain it in as much detail as possible. Your neighbors may wonder who you're talking to. So lots of testing. Take as many practice tests as you can get your hands on. If you don't have these tests, make them up on your own. Trade with a friend in class. So this is an example. After lecture, you say, if I were the professor, what are some questions I would ask on a quiz or a test for the class? You're reading the subject and you're like, if I were the professor and I was reviewing this chapter, what are some quiz questions I would come up with? So you write those down on index cards on a sheet of paper and you cut it up, and now you've got your sample practice test to work with. And if you have a friend in the class, you can say, hey, why don't we make a list of questions we would ask and trade them with each other so that we get more practice. And then keep that list, and after the quiz or the exam, see how many you got that you actually pulled and were able to get close to what the teacher said. Or as you're doing practice problems, if you're like, I've done this same step several times, I bet you I will have a similar practice question on the test. So just keep notes of those, and that will help you be more refined with your testing. Now I like the next two, switch it up and mix it up. So this goes back to what the Bajorks had studied, and they said switch between ideas during a study session. Don't study one idea for too long. So as much as we know about learning, what we have actually discovered is that most humans have the capacity to spend between 30 minutes and 120 minutes focused on a topic. So that's why a lot of classes are 50 minutes or 90 minutes. And if they go longer, they definitely have a break in between, because you start to lose steam. And every person has a different one. So maybe for me, it's 45 minutes is where I have the most strength. After 45 minutes, things are starting to take longer and more effort to stick, and I'm losing energy. So the longer I spend, the more energy it's taking for the less output. So we say break it up into smaller chunks and switch between the ideas. So if I'm studying for an hour, maybe I study 20 minutes on this one topic, and then I switch to this other topic, and then I switch to this other topic. And I've even seen students do 20 minutes, they're studying a thing in chemistry, and if they're brave, they're switching to biology. And if they're brave, they're switching to calculus, so they're switching between. But at the least, within the subject you're studying, switch the topic after 20, 30 minutes because you're starting to get hypnotized. So if you've ever driven from one place to the other and you get there and you don't remember driving, that's an example of your brain kind of doing what brains are supposed to do, of kicking information aside and not paying attention because it isn't important. So when you study one thing and you go too long, the brain starts to go, this really isn't crucial for survival. I'm going to stop paying attention. And so that's why you switch it up, so you keep your brain on its toes. So you've got that, switch it up. Next time you study, do it in a different order to mix it up. And that will help you on the recall. And I have students tell me, and they go, it doesn't feel as effective. I mean, when I stick with one thing and I do 3 hours of it, it feels like I'm really going in deep. And when I break things up and I'm switching between the topics and I'm doing these shorter things of chunks of studying, it feels like I have to struggle so much to remember where I was last at, and it takes all this time to review where I was at so I can pick up and go. And they're like, it's all this struggle. And I'm like, that's the learning. That is what's making it stand out in your brain, and that is what is strengthening the recall. So if it feels uncomfortable and it feels less effective, it's actually more effective. But people will report, even if they know it's more effective, they go, gosh, but it still feels like a struggle. That's human, but it's one of those things, if you do it, it's actually better. And then this one is just talking about the chunks of time. So it is better to study 10 hours over a week long time than to study 10 hours the day before the exam. Because if you go back to those things, that's where you're getting your power from. And so we tell people, spread it out throughout, so you have to touch upon it several times rather than all right before. And this is hard. This is hard when you are managing a schedule that can be very full with people commitments, living life, and working. And now here's the spacing it out. And so when you review information from the most recent class, make sure you go back and study important, older information to keep it fresh. So that you're building on it, especially for classes that are cumulative and you're having a cumulative exam. If every day before class you review what you studied on the last notes, and then later at the end of the week you do a week-long review, and then the next week you go and you review stuff from the month before, you are retouching on those things and you're helping to force that recall. And I am just going to check. If it's more effective to do chunks of 30 minutes, what are some methods to concentrate during a lecture? I've been having a hard time to stay focused during Zoom lectures, and I sometimes work on something else because I can't focus. This is excellent, and sometimes it's hard because everything the professor is saying is important. But what I tell folks is, even if you take a 1-minute break and you get up and you walk around, you jog for a minute in place, you do something that spruces it up, that it can help. And plus on Zoom, you have the ability, and right now you could even practice it. So, I've been going on for a little bit and it starts to get, like you get into a groove and you're like thinking about other things. Right now you have the power to stand up, be behind your camera, and just do some stretching exercises, or to walk around the room and, as take a break from listening and then come back to it, but just do some movement and divert your attention and then snap it back. But that's the honest truth, and that's why I really wish in Zoom stuff we gave people more breaks, because I feel like it's even more taxing than in class. And I don't know if it's because, at least in class, you move around, you walk in and out and things like that, versus, you're in one spot looking at a camera for several hours in a row. But that's a really good thing, and it's worth a minute away from the material to bring yourself back to it. Keep asking questions. These are great questions. So I love this clip. Teacher says, highlight only important parts. So one of the things I do is when I sit down with students and we talk about studying techniques, I say, show me how you take your notes. Show me how you read the text for the class. And that sometimes students are copying notes verbatim from the text, or they're highlighting everything. And it is far more effective to write a summary statement and to write a word and come back and quiz yourself on it, and you list out everything that you can remember, and then you check your notes to see how much you remembered. Because that actually is more intensive than the copying every note and highlighting the whole text. But here are a couple other, actually, let me ask you all this. What is your favorite studying technique of any sort? I'm going to talk a little specifically on note taking and stuff, but I want to know from you all, is there a good study technique that you do that you want to share with each other? I always learn something new when I ask this. Spaced repetition. Oh, I like that. Anyone else got a good note taking or study technique that they use? No? Explaining it to someone. That is awesome. I'm more hands-on these days. I have to practice problems to understand the material. That is so real. Quizzing myself. That's awesome. Yeah, in studies that they have found, they took a group of people and they gave them 3 study sessions, and then they took an exam. And they took a similar group of other people from the class, and they gave them 2 study sessions but 1 practice test, and they did far better on the exam, even with less time studying and more time practice testing. So I will move to the next thing. I'm a visual learner. Sometimes I study with the professor. I would go into office hours and practice. That is so awesome. Creating fictitious stories and relating the material. I love that. That's a really good strategy. These are good. Keep putting them in if they come to you. You know, a lot of times people ask, like, what do I need to do to take notes in lectures? And one thing is, think about how you get organized with your notes. So making sure, do you like to have space to draw diagrams in your notes? Do you write your notes and then you want to write notes separate from the book, from the lecture, and then tape them together? Do you use colors, different highlighters? Do you write examples of how it relates in real life in the margins? So just thinking about the strategies and what you use to prepare yourself with note-taking. And when you are in class, paying attention to the repetition, what gets written on the board, numbers, people's formulas that tend to come up. When the instructor uses gestures, a lot of times when we get excited and we're into something, we will use our hands or we will draw things out in the air when the voice gets louder. And then signposts. So these words indicate a new topic or a point that is important. So when people say next, similarly, most importantly. And if you start to really listen, each professor has some key words that usually is around a concept that they want you to remember. And so once you clue in on those key words, you can start writing it down when they follow with important information. Oh, somebody said having a conversation with self in the shower. That is another excellent one. Oh, I'm getting good ideas from you all. So with note-taking styles, the Cornell note-taking method is one of the most famous, and it's simply because they divided the sheet of paper into 3 areas, and they write the main ideas in the left column, then they write details about those ideas in the right column, and then at the bottom they write a summary. And so they quiz themselves by covering the right column. So in other words, they would cover all those specific details explaining the words, and they would quiz themselves on what they remember with the words. And so that became one method. But I've seen students do a lot of different ones. I've seen students fold a paper in half and use half to write lecture notes, half to write notes from the text. I've seen people write notes and they leave a little margin on the left or the right side to write quiz questions. So just thinking what method works best for you depending on the material you're learning. And I will say, when I have met with students, sometimes the struggle is the notes that they take for sociology may not work well for history. It may require a different type of notes. So it's figuring out what note style do you need for what class. And an example would be outlines. Outlines tend to be very good for history and for things like that, where you're organizing pieces of information together under a concept, but putting some of the specifics down. So just think about the types of note-taking that work for you and what you prefer in your note-taking style. A really cool activity to do is take notes for class, see if you have a friend or someone you meet in the class, and exchange notes with each other. Because it's interesting to learn how other people take notes, and if they're capturing things in a different way than you are, that you might want to incorporate that style. And so we tell folks, you know, here's a note-taking checklist, because note-taking isn't just a one-time thing. It's a whole process. What occurs before class? Skimming the notes, reviewing the reading assignments, checking the syllabus to see what's due when. During class, sitting up front where you can hear, or setting up your workstation to avoid distractions. I've been talking to students and I just look now, like my phone's on the other side of the room, so I'm not distracted while I'm with you all and I'm paying attention to you all. So I have seen students, they're telling me that they're putting their phone under a pillow, or their phone is where they're watching and they make sure they turn off notifications, doing things that reduce the things that take our attention away. Every time I hear someone say, I'm excellent at multitasking, the truth is that study after study has shown when you're multitasking, you're losing pieces of information. It is impossible to be at a high level with two things diverting your attention at the same time. And sometimes it's okay. We do multitasking to survive in life. We only have so much time, so we need to get stuff done. But you lose things. And in some classes, losing those things, it's not what you want to do. It's too important. You're losing big pieces of information. So focusing, having your attention, writing ideas using phrases, abbreviations, adding information to outline notes, asking yourself questions, asking the professor questions, and leaving spaces on your notes to add more information later. And then after class, being sure you're going over your notes, you're clarifying, you're seeing what you got, what you're still fuzzy on, maybe making yourself summarize some key points, writing examples of the concepts, creating potential test questions, and reviewing this throughout. So just some different things. And I tell folks, when you look at a list like this, you don't have to do everything that's on here. See what works for your style and adapt it and take pieces of different things to blend together if that's what works best for you. In helping recall information, especially in our note-taking, things like concept maps are really good, where you have to fill in boxes and show relationships in a diagram form between things, and show maybe the hierarchy or the order or the sequence. It's, again, that superpower of diagrams. It stands out in your head. And the fact that you are taking things and putting them in visual form. It's called dual coding, and it's just super strong. And so practice testing could be flashcards, practice test or end of the chapter reviews, teaching others in a study group, creating a visual aid from memory, or retyping or rewriting your notes using minimal cues from your book. So just think about the different ways in which you can quiz yourself. One student told me they got a mason jar and they would write all these questions in and put it in, and then when they had time between things they would pull it out and they would answer that while they were doing a household chore or something like that. And it was just an interactive way of quizzing themselves. Brain mapping. I'd have to learn more. What is brain mapping? Now I'm intrigued.
I was actually just introduced to this last semester. Our teacher had us write down ideas for our topic papers, and then look up the words that had came up, and then kind of map out how it connected to each other. This was for women's studies, so
Mm-hmm.
uh, more writing than actual math or anything like that. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, when you looked up the definition, it gave you another word, and then you were able to add that to your brain map, and then spin off from there on, and also correlate it to your thesis of your paper.
That is a brilliant concept mapping for writing and researching a paper. It's slightly different than the example I have here, but it's that same process of laying out ideas in the order and then adding to it. That was a really good strategy for writing a paper.
I see your wheels spinning.
I'm like, ooh, I'm gonna adapt that and use it with some of the students I'm working with. Thank you. Yeah, and if you all have other things that you're like, ooh, what about this? What about that? Feel free to put them in the notes. I mean, in the chat. All right, so this is the last one I have formally in my presentation. And this is a reading strategy. So a lot of students, I talked about the note taking and how you organize yourself and how you organize your thoughts and are capturing lecture and reading notes. But a lot of students have questions on how to read. And the number one thing that they come up with is sometimes there aren't enough hours in the day to read as deeply each and every piece of information as we would like or as the professor wants. It is just impossible. And it gets magnified, especially those of you who may be taking graduate or upper level classes. They go at a fast pace. They give so much reading that it does seem humanly impossible to absorb it deeply and know it. And so that's why some strategies that help you learn the big picture concepts and then go back and fill in the details can be really important. And so the first thing I tell students to do is the initial go through with something that you're reading, start off with surveying it. Flip through the pages, see the headers, get familiar with how the chapter is organized. Look for the big larger headings and maybe capture those because those are going to be how your notes are organized. Pay attention to the layout, the chapters, the sections, the graphs, the pictures, and highlighted words. So do that initial survey. Then the next time you go through, you're going to be, doing things like asking yourself questions about the text. Ask yourself what you already know about the text and what your goal is. Try to understand what it is the author wants to convey. So just as you're reading, ask yourself questions about the reading. And I've seen students do an initial survey. They read to understand, and then they go back and read and take notes. And again, you're touching upon it multiple times. You're starting to make the meaning deeper each time you go through, and you're getting your mind primed for it. So with reading, read the text actively while keeping the previous steps in the back of your mind. Write down initial questions and try to answer asked questions. I've seen students read out loud. I've seen students walk across the room reading. I've seen students stay at one spot and read. So there is no magic behind how you're reading. It depends on you and the kind of activity you like with your reading. With reciting, this is one of the 3 R's. With reciting, repeat out loud in your own words what you have read. do those summary statements. Ask yourself questions about the text. Explain to someone else what you have read and try to write a summary. And this is where you could relate it to real life examples, or how would you explain and teach someone else this concept. And then review. Read all the relevant parts again, go through your notes and questions again, pay extra attention to the parts you find difficult. So if you do a quick search on the internet for SQ3R, you'll see lots of different folks. They have worksheets that guide through and things like that. You can make your own sheet on it. Even if you don't like it, if you're like, I don't really like that, then do these 3 basic things of surveying, reading to understand, and then go back a 3rd time and read and write your notes. Because those multiple times will really help layer the information and build it in a way that you'll remember. Does anyone have a reading strategy they want to share? Anything that they use for their subject matter that really helps?
I write down key concepts. Writing helps me remember what the key concepts are. Then when I go back through and listen to it, because I'm an auditory learner, I can relate that and actually reflect it in my writing response.
Oh, I love that. I love that. And we got in the chat reading, then talking to myself as I'm having a conversation, explaining whatever I read to myself. I love that. I was working with a student who would write down key concepts on a post-it note and then put it on their door. And then later on, while they were doing exercises, they looked at those concepts on the door and they tried to recall as much as they could about those concepts.
I use a learning objective that my professors would provide as a guideline. They're kind of
Ooh.
concepts. I use that as like a outline. So I would go into my textbook or an article, and I would find content. So it saves a lot of time for me by doing.
Oh, that's an excellent strategy. Thank you.
Yeah.
Taking notes while reading and using those notes to create a summary and splitting up reading among students in the class. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I like the jigsaw method in study groups where everybody's reading everything, but some people are assigned within a study group, like you read this chapter, you read this chapter, you read this chapter really deeply so that you can explain it and teach us those concepts. And people splitting up the learning like that and helping to piece together the information so that everyone's stronger. Especially with classes that have so much content that it almost feels impossible to learn it all at once.
I've also done in study groups, we would look at the chapter and one person runs through the chapter like how the professor would lecture it.
Mm.
And then and have my other friends ask questions. And then so we would rotate every session like that.
I think that's awesome. I mean, I think it's the most powerful learning you can do, of teaching each other and splitting it up like that. That's just great. Well, at this point, I want to know, do you all have any questions about the LRC services, about how the brain works with learning, about learning strategies or specific study tips?
There had been some discussion about CII actually having tutors at our location or as part of the department.
Mm-hmm.
Can you further elaborate on that? Is that just a rumor in the rumor mill, or what's going on?
And that is a great question. I'll have to check with my tutoring coordinator, Elizabeth, because she was working with Sun to get that up and running. And so I haven't touched base with them recently. So that's a good reminder that I need to. And I thought that they were going to hire some folks. The only thing that threw a glitch in the plan, so for other folks here, um, we do have one tutor. The the intent was to get some people who would be trained by the LRC, and they could be open to anyone for tutoring, but they would really help build community within CII of providing tutoring, for folks. And when we're in person, it'll have a different power because they could actually be in the center and hold their hours in the center. And so that's really cool. Right now it would be an online version. And so, like James said, we have one tutor, and it's something we want to build and get the right structure in place, and then start to hire more CII students to be tutors who could do tutoring in the center in the CII center, and could also do tutoring for the LRC if they wanted to earn more money. Do y'all think that's a good idea or no?
Absolutely. I do. We want to make sure that that students that come into CII are able to have like a one-stop shop, which is why we've opened up to the programming and the workshops like the one you're presenting today, so that our students are served better.
Mm-hmm. And I like that. And does the LRC have a motivation related workshop? I'll come back to that in 1 second. The one thing I was going to say is in the LRC, so my background is learning communities and multicultural affairs and international student services. And so there's a power of studying and learning together, and I love when folks meet people who are different than themselves, but I also love when they build a strong community from within. And so we really want to try to do study groups, tutoring, workshops that bring people together to form stronger communities based on, it could be identity, it could be on the subject matter, whatever it is. And so, motivation related workshop. We have Michelle who does our workshops. She's awesome. She does everything from anxiety, like test taking anxiety and procrastination. So I'm thinking that within her avoiding procrastination workshop, she has a little bit about goal setting and how to get yourself motivated and breaking down those tasks, those big tasks, into little pieces. And if she doesn't have a specific workshop available, and if it isn't in our workshop library of those 50 workshops we have, then meeting with Michelle, she can talk about specific motivational strategies individually with students. You betcha. And I am putting in the chat Michelle's email. And if you go on to Navigate, you can also sign up for an appointment with her, whether it's one of those hour-long workshop topics or a half-an-hour coaching session. So even if, and here's something to consider, I have met with students in the past who'll sign up for a coaching session with me, and when I meet with them, they're like, oh, I'm a peer mentor or a peer leader, and I really want to collect information on this topic to be able to share with my students. And I will make sure they have the explanations, maybe some additional handouts. So if you're involved in a student organization or you're working as a peer mentor with other students, and you want to gather information for them, come meet with us. We'll help you put together a packet so that you can share with your students. These are great questions. And I have a few more minutes if anyone has any other questions, but I won't keep you if you don't. Michelle would love to work. She does, well, actually, and you can email her, and also on our webpage, we have a page that we're developing, and it's called Staff and Faculty Resources. And on that page, there should be a link for under workshops to request a workshop. And so, but you can also initiate that by just emailing Michelle, and she can help put together workshops on different times. Like her and I, we've done anything from 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on what people need. And I'm telling students, like, if you have a student org, you want us to come in and do a 20-minute, like, study tips things or talk about a few tips, and then we leave and you have your group organization meeting, we can do that. We're trying to embed in little pieces and information and hit upon it multiple times so that students learn.
We have two student org presidents, Aja and Judy.
Okay.
Um, we'll definitely get your contact information and get that out there to the student orgs that we service at CII.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I want to thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for joining us today, LA. We have some great things in the work for LRC, CII collaboratives. So we will definitely be in contact. And does anyone have any last minute questions? Come work with us.
Yep. In about another month, we'll start to have all our postings, and I'll make sure I send something to you all just saying we are starting to hire tutors, iPrep leaders, supplemental instruction facilitators, study group leaders. Like, I'll make sure that we share those opportunities, and I will share this PowerPoint with Natalia so that you all can receive a copy of it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Wonderful way to start my Friday morning. Thank you all so much.